In the sprawling corridors of the Galactic Concord's Grand Assembly Hall, representatives from 100 star systems convened, a mosaic of cultures, species, and ideologies united by the fragile threads of diplomacy. The air crackled with the tension of countless unspoken rivalries, the quiet friction of traditions and beliefs clashing beneath a polished surface of mutual cooperation. Among these gathered species, the humans were a curious anomaly. Relatively new to the interstellar stage, they arrived not with the overwhelming power of ancient empires like the Zealry, nor the cold, calculative wisdom of the Drolnar. They lacked the sheer physical prowess of the Vark, a species renowned for their martial might, whose warriors could cleave through armor with a swipe of their blade-tipped tails. By most measures, humans were unremarkable: moderate strength, average intelligence, limited lifespan. Yet, in their short time on the galactic stage, they had forged alliances and demonstrated a tenacity that could not be dismissed. However, there was a perception, unspoken yet pervasive, that humans were timid. In council meetings, they often sat quietly at the back, observing more than participating. They refrained from bold declarations and boisterous challenges that the Vark and other proud species relished. When conflicts arose, the humans often suggested mediation before retaliation, a behavior seen by some as weakness. For the Vark, whose culture valued direct confrontation and strength, the humans perceived caution bordered on cowardice. Garoth, a decorated commander of the Vark, embodied this perception. Having fought through centuries of brutal conflicts, his skin bore the marks of countless battles, scars earned and honored. To him, power was the ultimate measure of a species' worth, and hesitation in wielding it was a sign of fear. He watched the humans with a mix of curiosity and disdain, puzzled by their reserved nature. Whenever discussions grew heated, he noted the humans' subtle withdrawal, the way they observed intently yet spoke sparingly. It seemed to Garoth that these soft-spoken beings had little place in the brutal, relentless reality of interstellar politics. Conversations with other delegates reinforced this belief. The Drolnar saw the humans' adaptability as desperation, a sign of a species struggling to survive, rather than one confident in its strength. The Zealry, ancient and calculating, viewed them as naive, a species yet to be hardened by betrayal and loss on a galactic scale. Even those who sought the humans' friendship did so with an underlying belief that they could be shaped, molded to fit the ambitions of greater powers. And yet, for all their perceived passivity, the humans endured. They navigated diplomatic disputes with patience, diffused hostilities with a calm that bordered on unnerving. In simulations of combat strategy exercises meant to prepare for possible conflicts, they displayed an unorthodox creativity that baffled their counterparts. While other species sought victory through overwhelming strength or calculated precision, the humans relied on unpredictability, resourcefulness, and a willingness to sacrifice that bordered on reckless. Garoth, ever observant yet skeptical, noted these contradictions. How could a species so seemingly restrained in diplomacy be so ruthless in simulation? How could beings who hesitated in council meetings act with such ruthless decisiveness in hypothetical warfare? There was an inconsistency, an enigma he couldn't unravel. The perception of humanity as a lesser, hesitant species solidified into a quiet consensus. During military exercises, the Vark stood at the forefront, leading charges with unrelenting ferocity. The Drolnar orchestrated strategies with meticulous precision, commanding from central positions. The humans, ever observant, ever waiting, took positions at the rear. Some joked that they stayed back to avoid the heat of battle, to shield themselves from the first, fiercest waves of attack. It was a jest that carried a lingering bite of derision, an undercurrent of disdain that Garoth found both amusing and irritating. Yet the humans never reacted with anger to such comments. They responded with faint smiles, a quiet acknowledgement that seemed almost too understanding. They bore the skepticism and dismissal with a patience that seemed, to many, to confirm their timidity. In private moments, Garoth wondered if the humans truly understood the brutal calculus of survival that governed the galaxy. Had they truly grasped the weight of what it meant to be part of the Concord, a fragile unity born from necessity rather than genuine trust? He wondered if they would crumble when truly tested, when faced with a conflict that could not be negotiated away. Perhaps, when the moment came, the humans' fragile composure would shatter, revealing the truth of their weakness. Such musings seemed inconsequential questions to ponder in the quiet hours between strategy sessions and diplomatic debates. Garoth had no reason to believe that the humans would ever face such a trial. The Concord's strength, built on the foundations of its oldest and most formidable members, seemed unassailable. The humans were merely a new, inexperienced thread woven into the complex tapestry, one that could be replaced or discarded if needed. It was a belief shared by many, a perception so deeply rooted that no one questioned it. The humans sat in the back because that was where they belonged, observers, not actors, mediators, not warriors. They were a species that navigated the galaxy cautiously, warily, hesitant to act without overwhelming need. What no one yet understood was that the humans had learned through centuries of their own wars, betrayals, and loss that those who sit quietly at the back often see the most. They see the patterns others miss, the tensions that ripple beneath the surface, the fractures that might one day split apart alliances thought unbreakable. They had learned that survival in a universe as vast and indifferent as this required more than strength. It required restraint, observation, and a willingness to act only when the time was right. That time, unbeknownst to Garoth and the others, was rapidly approaching. The moment when the humans would be forced to step forward from their quiet corners and show a side of themselves that no one had expected, a side forged in fire and tempered by loss. The ambush came swiftly and without warning, a coordinated strike that shattered the veneer of stability the Galactic Concord had so carefully maintained. The diplomatic fleet, carrying delegates from dozens of star systems, had gathered in what was thought to be a secure, neutral zone. The location had been chosen precisely for its seclusion far from contested territories, a place where politics could not reach with sharpened claws. The gathering was meant to strengthen alliances, to demonstrate unity amidst growing tensions. Yet, as is so often the case in a galaxy of competing interests, unity is a fragile construct, easily shattered by those willing to wield chaos as a weapon. The attack began with a series of calculated disruptions. Communication channels suddenly scrambled, navigation systems hijacked by unseen forces. Panic rippled through the fleet, confusion mutating into fear. Starships designed for diplomatic missions, elegant and unarmed, found themselves trapped, their propulsion systems dead, their defensive measures insufficient. The first explosion rocked the flagship of the Zealary delegation, a ship renowned for its grandeur and influence. Fire blossomed from its hull, a brilliant, terrifying bloom that scattered debris and sent shockwaves through the surrounding ships. It became clear, with an abrupt and chilling certainty, that this was no accident. The attackers had planned meticulously, exploiting the vulnerabilities of a fleet that had grown complacent in its belief that diplomacy could protect it from the harsher realities of a hostile galaxy. Warships of unknown origin emerged from the dark, sleek, predatory vessels bristling with weapons. They tore through the scattered fleet, their weapons precise and merciless. Garoth, aboard the Vark battleship Vorshak, felt a surge of familiar adrenaline. In chaos, there was clarity, a simple equation of survival. The Vark had trained for conflict all their lives. Battle was their element, the fire that forged their identity. He barked orders to his crew, his voice steady and commanding. Shields up, defensive formations, prepare for counterattack. To fight was to live, to surrender was to die, a creed as old as their bloodlines. The Drolnar, calculating and strategic, attempted to coordinate a response. Their analytical minds raced to decipher the attackers' tactics, searching for a pattern, a weakness. The Zealary, stunned by the loss of their flagship, struggled to regain their composure, their pride wounded as deeply as their fleet. Chaos reigned, each species falling back on instinct, the fragile unity of the Concord splintering under the weight of raw, unbridled violence. Amid the chaos, the humans found themselves at the rear of the formation, their modest ships ill-suited for the scale of destruction unfolding before them. For those who had long viewed the humans as timid observers, this moment seemed a grim confirmation of their suspicions. Surely, the humans would retreat, slipping away while the stronger, more established powers bore the brunt of the assault. Garoth, amidst the cacophony of battle, spared a glance at the human ship's small, unassuming vessels that seemed hopelessly outmatched. Yet, in the heart of turmoil, the humans did not retreat. Their ships moved with precision, calculated and coordinated. Their communications, though scrambled, found ways to cut through the interference. They began to organize a task force of scouts and analysts, piecing together the fragmented signals to reconstruct a broader picture of the attack. Their voices, calm and focused, cut through the panic, identifying enemy positions, mapping out blind spots, coordinating defensive maneuvers. While others flailed in the chaos, the humans adapted, drawing on the very traits that had once been seen as hesitation and caution. Commander Illyra Mason, the ranking officer of the human fleet, assessed the battlefield with a practiced eye. Her calm belied the urgency of the moment, a steadying force in a tempest. She saw the pattern, how the attackers exploited the disarray, striking isolated ships and retreating before counter-fire could land. She saw the gaps in the Concord's defenses, the fractures that widened with each blast. And in a moment of clarity, she made a choice. To all Concorde ships, her voice rang through the comms, measured but unyielding. Fall back to Sector Theta 7. Regroup and consolidate. Vark vessels, hold the line. Drolnar, focus on disrupting their targeting systems. We can turn this if we fight together. There was hesitation, a split second of disbelief that the humans, the quiet observers, were now issuing commands. Yet, amidst the chaos, her voice carried weight, a steady, unrelenting confidence that cut through the fear. One by one, ships began to fall back, reorienting themselves to the designated sector. The Vark, their pride tempered by necessity, formed a defensive front, shielding the retreating vessels. The Drolnar recalibrated their systems, jamming the attackers' targeting arrays. What had been a scattered, desperate defense coalesced into a unified effort, imperfect but determined. The attackers, sensing the shift, pressed harder, strikes faster, more vicious. The Vark ships absorbed the brunt of the assault, their shields strained, their hulls scarred. The humans, no longer merely observing, wove through the chaos, small, agile ships deploying decoys, drawing fire away from vulnerable allies. Their tactics, unconventional and audacious, defied the expectations of those who had once doubted their resolve. Garoth, amid the firestorm, saw how the humans moved, not as the hesitant diplomats they had seemed, but as warriors tempered by experience. Their strategy was not driven by raw strength, but by adaptability, a willingness to change course, to sacrifice, to see beyond the immediate clash. It was a form of strength that defied his understanding, a strength born not from dominance, but from survival. When the dust finally settled, the attackers, unable to break the newly formed defensive line, began to withdraw. Their ships vanished into the dark expanse, leaving the Concorde fleet battered but intact. The silence that followed was heavy, an echo of violence that lingered in the minds of those who had survived. As the wreckage was assessed and the wounded tended to, Garoth found himself regarding the humans with a new, unsettled respect. The quiet observers, the hesitant diplomats, had revealed a side of themselves that no one had anticipated. The misconception of their timidity had been shattered, replaced by a deeper, more complex truth. In the chaos of battle, the humans had not merely endured, they had adapted, and in doing so, had saved lives. For Garoth, and for many others, it was a revelation, an understanding that strength took many forms, that courage could manifest not only in defiance but in restraint. The humans had sat in the back not out of fear, but out of observation, seeing what others missed, waiting for the moment when their actions would have the greatest impact. And now, that moment had arrived. In the aftermath of the ambush, the Galactic Concorde found itself standing at a crossroads, its unity shaken, its trust fractured. The unknown assailants had disappeared into the cold, unyielding void of space, leaving behind wreckage and wounded pride. Diplomats and military leaders scrambled to make sense of the attack, seeking answers where none were readily available. Whispers spread like wildfire through the corridors of starships and command centers, suspicions, accusations, the gnawing sense that the galaxy's fragile peace had been little more than an illusion. What had been seen as a straightforward act of violence was, in reality, the opening move in a conflict that defied the conventions of open warfare, a shadow war fought not with armies but with subtlety and subterfuge. The Vark, whose strength had been a shield in the chaos of battle, seethed with frustration. They demanded retaliation, a show of force to remind the galaxy that they were not prey to be hunted. Garoth, who had seen the humans defy expectation and rise to the occasion, found himself caught between the rage of his people and the complexity of what lay before them. The Varks saw enemies where there were shadows, a battlefield where there was strategy. Their strength had always been in confronting threats head-on, in the clash of steel and the thunder of warships. Yet this threat was different, unseen, ungraspable, a predator that hunted through deception. The Drolnar, masters of calculation, retreated into their analysis, their minds sharp and relentless. They began to sift through intercepted signals, decoding encrypted transmissions, searching for patterns that might betray the identity of the attackers. Their suspicion of betrayal ran deep. Alliances forged in diplomacy now felt like traps set by unseen hands. Every fractured communication became a potential clue, every silence a threat. The Drolnar's brilliance lay in their detachment, their ability to view the galaxy not as a collection of species but as a vast, interconnected web of probabilities. Yet, even they struggled to untangle the threads of this unseen conflict. The Zealry, their pride bruised by the loss of their flagship, turned inward, nursing wounds both physical and psychological. Accustomed to reverence, they now found themselves vulnerable, their influence diminished. Their envoys spoke of peace while their military plotted retribution. They saw themselves as victims of a targeted strike, an attempt to destabilize their power within the Concord. The duality of their response, torn between diplomacy and vengeance, mirrored the uncertainty that gripped the entire coalition. The humans, who had once been underestimated, now stood at a crossroads of their own. Their role in stabilizing the ambush had earned them a measure of respect, yet that respect came with scrutiny. The other species wondered how had the humans acted so decisively? Was it insight, or had they known more than they let on? The shadow of suspicion fell upon them, a consequence of their unexpected competence. Commander Illyra Mason, whose voice had rallied the Concord in the darkest moments, found herself navigating a labyrinth of politics, questions that hinted at accusations, alliances that felt like traps. It was in this atmosphere of suspicion and fear that the Shadow War truly began. Small, seemingly unrelated incidents rippled across the galaxy, sabotaged supply routes, data breaches that revealed half-truths, diplomatic envoys that never reached their destinations. Accusations flew between factions, each fearing that the other sought to undermine their influence. The Concord's strength had always been its diversity, yet that diversity now became a vulnerability, mistrust blossoming between species that had once shared purpose. Garoth found himself torn between his loyalty to the Vark and his growing respect for the humans. He saw the strength in their adaptability, their willingness to approach problems from angles the Vark would never consider. Yet, that same adaptability made them unpredictable, difficult to trust. Rumors reached him, whispers of covert operations, of human agents embedded deep within the networks of the Concorde, gathering intelligence not to protect but to manipulate. The question haunted him: had the humans seen the ambush coming? Had they simply allowed it to unfold, positioning themselves as saviors in the chaos they had anticipated? Ilra Mason felt the weight of that suspicion. The respect earned in the heat of battle now felt tainted, a gift poisoned by paranoia. Meetings with her counterparts were strained, their glances sharpened by doubt. She saw the cracks in the alliances fraying, mistrust spreading. The humans had always been observers, cautious and watchful, their power measured not in brute force but in the quiet accumulation of knowledge. Now, that knowledge was a double-edged sword, a strength and a threat. The true architects of the Shadow War remained hidden, faceless, nameless, their motives obscured by the chaos they had sown. They thrived in the fractures of the Concorde, in the spaces between trust and fear. Where the Varks saw strength, they saw leverage. Where the Drolnar saw patterns, they saw misdirection. Where the Zealari saw pride, they saw weakness. The humans, adaptable and cautious, had become the perfect scapegoat, both hero and suspect, celebrated and reviled. As the Shadow War deepened, acts of sabotage escalated, stations disabled by mysterious malfunctions, intelligence leaked to stir animosity, alliances shattered by carefully crafted deceptions. The Concorde teetered on the edge of collapse, its members divided by fear and suspicion. Each faction believed they fought against an unseen enemy, unaware that they were all pawns in a conflict waged from the shadows. Garoth, weary of the growing discord, reached out to Ilra in a moment of vulnerability, a desperate attempt to find truth amid deception. In a quiet, guarded conversation, they shared their doubts, their fears, the sense that they were all being played by forces beyond their understanding. In that brief exchange, an uneasy alliance was born, a fragile, uncertain bond forged by the need to uncover the truth. The Shadow War continued, an invisible, unrelenting battle fought through subterfuge and fear. The galaxy remained shrouded in uncertainty, each species haunted by the specter of betrayal. Yet, in the midst of it all, a spark of hope endured, a belief that beneath the mistrust and the fear, there could still be understanding. That the Concorde, fractured but not yet broken, could find a way to stand together once more. As the fractured Concorde struggled to stabilize in the aftermath of the Shadow War's opening moves, a silence settled over the galaxy. It was an uneasy, brittle peace, an interlude in which suspicions simmered beneath every diplomatic conversation, every trade agreement, every hesitant gesture toward reconciliation. The unseen enemy had accomplished what they set out to do. They had seeded mistrust so deep that the Concorde's unity felt like a precarious charade. Rumors of a second attack loomed in the collective consciousness, a dark storm gathering on the horizon. The Vark, whose restlessness had only grown since the initial ambush, readied their fleets for the inevitable. The Drolnar continued their endless analysis, combing through encrypted data for the faintest echoes of a threat they could not yet name. The Zealari retreated further into their isolation, their once proud diplomacy now a guarded facade. and the humans caught between their role as unexpected heroes and suspected saboteurs found themselves balancing the knife's edge between ally and outcast. Commander Illyra Mason felt the weight of this ambiguity more than most. Her reputation as the voice that had united the coalition in the chaos of the first attack had become both a badge of honor and a target of scrutiny. Every decision she made was examined for hidden motives, every word dissected for double meanings. The burden of leadership, once driven by duty and purpose, now felt tainted by the corrosive gaze of mistrust. She longed for clarity, for the certainty of battle where strength and strategy prevailed over paranoia and politics. Then, the second wave came. It began not with a blaring alarm or the clash of fleets but with a quiet, insidious ripple through the communication networks of the Concord. Channels that had once connected worlds were severed, silenced by a calculated cyber assault that left star systems isolated, vulnerable. Supply lines faltered, essential resources failed to reach their destinations. Confusion and panic spread like a virus. By the time the first reports of physical attacks reached the Concord's fractured command, it was already too late. The second wave was a masterpiece of deception, a blend of digital sabotage and precision strikes that targeted the heart of the Concord's infrastructure. Space stations, once beacons of cooperation, were reduced to debris fields, their inhabitants left adrift in the unforgiving cold. Outposts fell silent, their fates unknown. The galaxy, vast and interconnected, suddenly felt like a series of isolated, terrified worlds. For the Vark, the second wave was a call to arms. Their fleets, already on the brink of action, surged forward with the ferocity of a wounded predator. Strength had always been their answer, an unyielding resolve to crush any who dared threaten them. Yet, for all their might, the Vark found themselves swinging at shadows. The enemy's strikes were precise, calculated, disappearing before retaliation could land. Frustration turned to desperation, and desperation bred recklessness. The Drolnar, brilliant but burdened by their analytical minds, saw the attack as a puzzle, a challenge they had to solve before it consumed them. Yet, even their most advanced algorithms struggled to make sense of the chaos. The patterns were inconsistent, the methods varied. The enemies seemed to understand the Drolnar's need for logic and used it against them, creating false trails that led to dead ends. For the first time, the Drolnar faced a foe whose cunning matched their own, and it unsettled them in ways they struggled to admit. The Zealry, their pride already wounded, saw the second wave as an insult, a calculated effort to erode their influence. Their attempts to broker peace and unity were met with scorn. Allies who had once revered their wisdom now viewed them as compromised, tainted by their vulnerability. The Zealry's elegance and poise became a mask for their fear, a fear that their time as the galaxy's guiding light was fading. Humanity, trapped in the crossfire of suspicion, became the target of renewed blame. Whispers of betrayal grew louder, claims that the humans had orchestrated the chaos to elevate their standing within the Concord. Commander Mason found herself cornered by accusations she could not dispel. Her authority, once seen as decisive, now felt like a liability. She had no answers, only questions that gnawed at her resolve. Had they misjudged the scope of the enemy's plan? Had their attempts to unify the coalition only further exposed its fractures? As the second wave raged on, a realization dawned across the Concorde, a terrifying, undeniable truth. The enemy was not fighting to conquer or to claim territory. They fought to divide, to dismantle the very foundation of trust upon which the Concorde had been built. Each act of sabotage, each strategic strike, was a scalpel cutting into the bonds that held the galaxy together. The Concorde's strength had always been its diversity, yet now that diversity was a weapon turned against itself. In a desperate attempt to reclaim control, Garroth of the Vark and Illyra Mason sought a covert meeting in an attempt to find clarity amidst the chaos. Their conversation was raw, filled with frustration and fear. Garroth, a warrior at heart, struggled to grasp an enemy he could not see, could not face head-on. Illyra, burdened by the weight of mistrust, questioned if their alliance could survive the damage already done. They spoke of sacrifice, of loyalty tested to its breaking point. For a moment, they found common ground not in strength, but in shared uncertainty. The second wave left the Concorde broken in ways no fleet could repair. Worlds that had once stood together now eyed each other with suspicion. Diplomacy became a theater of concealed intentions, alliances a fragile dance of necessity. The enemy remained a phantom unseen, unnamed, yet devastatingly effective. The Concorde's unity, a beacon of hope for countless worlds, had become a battleground of fear. And still, the Shadow War raged on, its architects hidden in the darkness, their motives a mystery. The Concorde stood at a precipice, uncertain whether to rebuild or to retreat into the safety of isolation. The bonds forged through centuries of cooperation were unraveling, and the question lingered: could they endure, or was the Concorde's end inevitable? In the silence that followed the second wave, a grim understanding took hold. The greatest threat was not the enemy that hid in the shadows, but the doubt that now lived within each of them, a doubt that, left unchecked, could destroy the Concorde from within. In the wake of the second wave, the galaxy felt less like an expanse of interconnected civilizations and more like a fractured, drifting mass of suspicion and fear. The attacks had left physical scars, devastated outposts, ruined stations, and scattered wreckage drifting through the vastness of space, but the psychological wounds ran deeper. The invisible enemy had achieved what few thought possible. They had shaken the Concorde to its core, and the once indomitable coalition now teetered on the brink of collapse. The Concorde's leadership convened in a desperate attempt to make sense of what had unfolded. Representatives from each race sat around the vast, circular chamber of the Concorde Council. Once a place of unity and debate, it now felt suffocating, burdened by suspicion. Conversations that once flowed freely were now laced with distrust. Accusations hovered unspoken, glances were guarded, and silence fell heavy between each tentative suggestion. Each species brought their own grievances, their own suspicions, convinced, at least in part, that the chaos might be employed by another member to secure dominance in a crumbling alliance. Amidst this strained environment, Commander Illyra Mason found herself grappling with doubts she could no longer ignore. She had fought to keep the coalition together, to maintain a semblance of trust in the face of relentless sabotage. Yet, the more she tried to hold the Concord together, the more it seemed to splinter. She had seen allies become adversaries, friends become suspects. The hope she had carried into the fight, the belief that their differences made them stronger, had become a weight on her heart. Was the enemy truly an external force, or had the seeds of this division always been lying dormant, waiting for a catalyst to expose them? In a moment of rare vulnerability, Illyr sought out Garroth of the Vark. The two had clashed before, warrior and strategist, force and finesse, but the burden of leadership had drawn them into a reluctant respect. She found him in a quiet chamber, his broad, scarred frame hunched over a hollow display of fragmented reports. The Vark general's expression was etched with frustration and exhaustion, his sharp eyes dulled by sleepless nights. When Illyr spoke, it was not as a commander, but as a comrade, someone grasping for answers in the dark. Garroth, she began softly, what if this isn't just an attack? What if this is something deeper? Something we can't fight the way we've fought before. Garroth's gaze hardened, his instincts recoiling at the suggestion. The Vark were a people of action, forged through centuries of conflict. Their strength lay in their ability to confront threats head-on, to crush opposition through raw, unyielding might. Yet this enemy had no face, no territory to besiege, only the whisper of malice and manipulation. What do you mean? He growled, his voice a rumble of restrained frustration. Are you suggesting we surrender? That we stand idle while they tear us apart? No, Illyr replied firmly. I'm saying that maybe we've been trying to understand this enemy on our terms. What if they don't think like us, don't see the galaxy the way we do? We've been treating this like a war, but what if it's more than that? What if it's evolution? Survival, but not as we define it. The words hung heavy in the air. Garroth's expression faltered, his defiance meeting an uncertainty that mirrored her own. The idea that they could not comprehend the enemy, not because of ignorance, but because of a fundamental difference in perception, was a terrifying realization. In the days that followed, the Concord began to reassess their approach. They brought together the greatest minds of the Drolnar, the enigmatic mystics of the Zealry, the adaptive strategists of humanity, and the warriors of the Vark. They sought to view the conflict not through the lens of victory or defeat, but through understanding. The Drolnar's analysts, who had once tried to dissect the enemy's tactics as if solving a puzzle, began to explore patterns beyond logic, patterns of chaos theory, of emergent behavior and the unpredictable nature of consciousness. The Zealry, whose insight often bordered on the esoteric, shared their oldest myths, stories of beings that existed beyond perception, whose actions were not defined by conquest but by survival at a scale incomprehensible to linear minds. Their legends spoke of forces that moved through the cosmos, unseen and unmeasured, influencing the fate of worlds without ever revealing themselves. These were not invaders, they were part of the galaxy's fabric, ancient and enigmatic. Human scientists, inspired by these theories, began to consider possibilities that defied conventional warfare. What if the enemy's intent was not to conquer, but to adapt. What if their strikes were not acts of aggression, but attempts to integrate to survive in a galaxy increasingly hostile to them? Was this a war or an attempt at coexistence from a perspective that the Concord could not yet fathom? Slowly, painfully, the Concord began to shift from retaliation to exploration. Instead of fortifying borders, they sought to understand the anomalies that had punctuated each attack. They examined the wreckage not for weaknesses, but for communication fragments of data that defied their understanding. They looked to the silence of the lost outposts not as a failure, but as a message, a gap in the noise that might hold meaning. Commander Laura Mason, once a warrior seeking victory, became a seeker of understanding. The burden of leadership no longer lay in commanding fleets but in guiding a coalition toward comprehension. It was a path fraught with uncertainty, a path that required vulnerability, a willingness to accept that their enemy might not be a conqueror, but a reflection of their own fear of the unknown. In the midst of this transformation, a signal was intercepted, fragmented, garbled, but undeniably deliberate. A pattern not of attack, but of communication. For the first time, the possibility emerged that the enemy was not a force to be defeated but a presence to be understood. The Concord stood on the precipice of a revelation, one that could reshape their perception of the galaxy itself. Would they find a way to bridge this unfathomable divide, or would fear continue to fracture the fragile unity they had fought so hard to preserve? In the silence that followed, as the Concord's greatest minds gathered to decipher the signal, a fragile hope began to stir, a hope that understanding the unfathomable might not be a path to victory, but a path to coexistence. In the wake of the revelation, the Concord stood at a crossroads. The intercepted signal, fragmented yet deliberate, had shaken the foundations of their understanding. What they had once seen as a faceless enemy now appeared as a misunderstood force, an entity reaching out through means the coalition had been too fearful to interpret. The shattered remnants of conflict still drifted across sectors, a silent testament to the brutality of their misunderstanding. Debris floated aimlessly, scarred ships hung lifelessly in the void, and outposts lay abandoned monuments to lives lost in a battle that no longer felt righteous. Commander Laura Mason had always believed in the strength of unity, but this new reality was more complex than any battle strategy. The enemies they had fought so fiercely against, creatures they had branded as invaders, destroyers, were possibly not invaders at all, but beings whose perception of existence was fundamentally alien to their own. The realization weighed heavily on her, an ache that refused to dissipate. She had fought to protect her people, to preserve the coalition she believed in. Yet, now she wondered if every decisive strike, every victory, had merely been a grave misunderstanding. The coalition itself struggled to adapt. The fractured council chambers of the Concord no longer buzzed with strategic debates but quiet, uncertain discussions. The Vark, who had known only strength in combat, faced a crisis of identity. General Garoth found himself in a position he had never imagined, questioning whether every enemy he had fought had truly been a threat or merely an unknown. The warrior ethos of the Vark had always dictated that a strike unanswered was a failure, but now, they had to reconsider what it meant to protect. The zealotry, whose insight had always dwelt on the philosophical, faced a different kind of reckoning. Their esoteric beliefs about balance and harmony were challenged if the enemy's attacks were attempts to communicate or survive. Then the Zealary's attempts to decipher and counter them had been missteps. In their introspection, they turned to their oldest texts, seeking parallels in the mythic tales of unseen forces and lost languages. The idea that the enemy's violence had been a desperate attempt at coexistence struck a raw nerve, one that forced them to re-evaluate the very essence of their understanding. For the Drolnar, whose logic had always been their strength, this new revelation was a paradox. Their calculations had been meticulous, their strategies precise, yet they had misread the nature of the threat. What they had perceived as calculated assaults had, perhaps, been fragmented attempts to reach out. The data they had so diligently analyzed now appeared less like a map of an enemy's intent and more like a chaotic, desperate signal, a cry in the dark from a species they had never truly seen. Among the humans, the ripple effect was no less profound. The pragmatism that had once driven their strategic responses now clashed with a deep sense of guilt. The families of those lost in the conflict began to question the purpose of their sacrifice. Was it necessary? Could their loved ones have been saved if the coalition had understood sooner? News feeds across human colonies played hollows of the wreckage, the haunting silhouettes of destroyed stations, the hollow shells of ships, and the unspoken grief of those left behind. The debates grew fierce, not just about the past, but about the path forward. Amidst this turmoil, Commander Mason found herself drawn back to the wreckage of Valtora's station, where the conflict had first revealed its complexity. She walked the corridors now stripped of life, echoes of the past reverberating in the silent halls. What had once been a symbol of defiance now felt like a graveyard, one filled with memories of friends and comrades whose lives had ended in the belief that they were fighting a righteous cause. It was there, standing amidst the debris and ashes of loss, that Illyra received a transmission. It was a news signal similar to the one the Concorde had intercepted, but clearer, more deliberate. Patterns danced across the hollow display, intricate yet fractured, like a language caught between intention and incomprehensibility. In that moment, Illyra realized the truth: the attempts at communication had not ended. The enemy, or whatever this presence was, had not given up. Her pulse quickened. She transmitted the signal to the Concorde, to the Zealary interpreters and the Drolnar analysts. Hours stretched into days as the coalition worked, not as warriors but as seekers trying to piece together meaning from the fragments of a language they barely grasped. The progress was slow, agonizing, yet hope bloomed where once there had been only fear. The coalition's war rooms became research centers, their strategists became linguists, and their warriors became mediators. And then, a breakthrough, a pattern deciphered, a message partially translated. It was not an attack, not a threat, but a question: can you understand us? The weight of that simple inquiry was staggering. It was not a demand, not a declaration of war, but a plea for understanding from a presence that had been as isolated and desperate as the Concorde had felt. The revelation rippled outward, reaching every corner of the coalition. The scars of the conflict would remain, the memories of loss etched into the hearts of all who had fought and suffered. Yet, there was a chance and opportunity to move beyond the wounds of the past and toward a future defined not by fear, but by understanding. For Commander Laura Mason, the journey was far from over. The path ahead would be uncertain, fraught with challenges as the coalition sought to truly comprehend this presence, this force that had once been seen as a faceless enemy. But it was a path worth taking, a path that could reshape the galaxy not through domination or division, but through a shared effort to bridge the unfathomable. The coalition had been fractured, their unity tested, but now, standing at the edge of the unknown, they saw a glimmer of hope, a possibility that understanding, no matter how elusive, could heal the wounds of a conflict born from fear. The war had left scars, some visible, etched into the hulls of ships and the charred remains of outposts, while others were buried deep within the hearts of those who had endured the conflict. As the coalition began to rebuild, there lingered an unsettling question that no one dared voice aloud. Had they truly uncovered the full extent of the enemy they had fought? The shattered fragments of intercepted signals had revealed a possibility, a desperate, misunderstood attempt at communication. Yet the truth felt incomplete, an unfinished puzzle where the final piece eluded them. Commander Laura Mason found herself haunted by a sense of incompleteness. The coalition had begun its attempts at communication with the elusive presence they had once called the enemy, but the progress was painfully slow. The fragments of language, patterns of light and sound that felt both alien and oddly familiar refused to yield their secrets fully. Every small breakthrough seemed to lead to more questions. The more they tried to understand, the more it became clear that this presence was not a monolith but a fractured, multifaceted entity, a complexity that defied categorization. As weeks turned to months, a series of unexplained incidents began to ripple through the coalition's territories. Small outposts went silent without warning. Supply routes that had been secured now faced sudden, inexplicable disruptions. Patrols reported ghostly ships on long-range sensors flickering in and out of existence, too elusive to track but undeniably there. These disturbances defied logic. There was no pattern, no declaration of hostility, only the unnerving sense that something was observing, waiting just beyond their perception. Rumors began to spread, quiet, anxious whispers in mess halls and on crowded station decks. Some believed it was a resurgence of the enemy, a faction of the presence they had failed to understand. Others spoke of an internal division within the coalition, sabotage from within by those who could not accept the fragile truce. There were even those who dared suggest that the very presence they had sought to understand was manipulating the May shadow force, playing with the coalition's fractured unity. Commander Mason could not shake the feeling that the truth lay somewhere between these fragmented fears. She pored over reports, every intercepted signal, every ghostly sighting, every anomaly that defied reason. Her nights became restless, her mind a tangled web of possibilities and uncertainties. She found herself doubting the coalition's narrative, wondering if their attempt to communicate had been another misstep, an invitation to a force they still did not comprehend. Then came the incident at the Hesperian outpost. A remote scientific station, Hesperian had been tasked with monitoring subspace anomalies, a quiet, uneventful assignment. When its communications fell silent, a recovery team was sent, expecting a simple technical failure. What they found instead was chilling, a station eerily intact but entirely devoid of life. Terminals still hummed softly, data feeds scrolled with unmonitored streams of information, and personal effects lay undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of an attack, only the silent, haunting absence of the crew. The Coalition's analysts pored over the station's logs, searching for answers. Amid the mundane recordings of sensor data and atmospheric fluctuations, they found a fragmented anomaly recorded just moments before the station's silence. It was a pulse, a burst of energy that resonated at a frequency no known species used. Within that pulse was a pattern, faint, fragmented, yet unmistakably similar to the signals the Coalition had struggled to decipher. It was not a message, but an echo, a resonance of something far deeper than a misunderstood enemy. The incident at Hesperian reignited the Coalition's fears. If this presence could reach so deeply, so silently, what else could it do? Had they ever truly communicated, or had they only brushed against the surface of something far more complex, far more dangerous? The lines between enemy and ally blurred as the Coalition realized that their understanding had been built on fragile assumptions. In the wake of Hesperian, Commander Mason faced the Council, a fractured assembly of species whose unity had been tested to its limits. The debate was fierce, wavering between caution and desperation. Some called for a retraction, an end to the attempts at communication, a retreat to defensible positions. Others, driven by the hope of understanding, argued for deeper exploration, a willingness to risk the unknown for the chance of true comprehension. Ilra's voice, steady yet burdened, broke through the discord. She spoke not as a commander but as a survivor, someone who had seen the cost of conflict and the fragility of peace. She proposed a new approach, not as warriors seeking to defend, nor as scientists seeking to dissect, but as beings willing to confront the darkness of the unknown with vulnerability. To accept that they were not simply uncovering an enemy, they were glimpsing into a consciousness that defied their understanding. It was a gamble, a fragile attempt to balance fear and hope. The Coalition would continue its attempts to communicate, but with caution, acknowledging that what they faced might not see them as they saw themselves. It might not possess intent in any sense they could grasp. The unseen enemy was not an entity they could conquer or appease, but a presence they would have to learn to coexist with, a force that could just as easily be their undoing as their salvation. The galaxy had changed, not through a battle won or lost, but through the realization that some threats could not be faced with weapons or shields. The unseen enemy was not just a force to be understood, it was a mirror, reflecting the Coalition's deepest fears, vulnerabilities, and the limits of their perception. Commander Mason knew the path ahead would not be easy. The Coalition's unity hung by a thread, fragile and uncertain. Yet, for the first time, they faced the unknown not as conquerors or victims, but as explorers humbled by the vastness of what they could not see and determined, however cautiously, to seek a future beyond the boundaries of their fear. The fragile peace that had settled after the first confrontation felt more like an uneasy truce than a true understanding. The coalition had tasted the bitter fruit of conflict and was still grappling with the complexity of an enemy that defied comprehension. For a time, there was hope that the attempts at communication, those halting, fragmented exchanges, might lead to a bridge, a fragile connection between civilizations separated by a chasm of perception. Yet hope, as delicate as it was, could not withstand the relentless grip of fear. Commander Illyra Mason had not forgotten the incident at the Hesperian outpost. The hollow, silent station haunted her thoughts. There had been no answers, only the lingering question of what had truly happened to those who had vanished. The coalition's analysts, exhausted and frustrated, had declared the incident a tragic accident, an anomaly. They called it something beyond the enemy's intent. But deep within, Mason knew that it had been a message, a whisper from a presence that did not fit the coalition's narrative of a misunderstood adversary. It was a reminder that they still did not grasp the scope of what they faced. The coalition's attempts to strengthen their defenses had been cautious yet determined. Patrols were doubled, sensor nets expanded, and outposts fortified. Every diplomatic envoy sent toward the unknown carried with it an unspoken dread and acknowledgement that each outreach could be their last. Despite the Council's insistence on maintaining efforts toward communication, the coalition prepared for war. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily upon every commander, every captain tasked with guarding the fragile boundaries of their territories. It was during this tense interlude that the second ambush unfolded, an attack that shattered the illusion of preparation and revealed just how vulnerable they remained. The outpost of Calderas, situated on the edge of a remote system, had always been considered a secure point, a location monitored and shielded by the most advanced technology the coalition could muster. It was not a place of strategic significance, but a waypoint for civilian transport and research vessels. Its destruction should have been impossible. Mason was aboard the Vanguard when the distress signal reached the fractured, desperate transmission of alarms and fragmented voices. By the time they arrived, the scene that greeted them was a vision of devastation. The outpost was reduced to floating wreckage, debris scattering like ash on the solar wind. The remains of once thriving habitat rings drifted aimlessly, hollow and silent. The Vanguard's sensors detected no life signs, only the residual heat of a battle that had burned bright and fast, leaving no survivors to recount its fury. The coalition's protocols dictated that they search the wreckage for data, for any fragments of information that could explain the attack. What they found chilled them, a record of the ambush, captured by automated systems moments before they fell silent. It was not a clash of fleets or a siege of overwhelming firepower. The enemy had not emerged in force but as a shadow, an unseen, unfathomable force that bypassed the outpost's defenses as if they were inconsequential. The attack was precise, almost surgical, targeting critical systems with an efficiency that felt less like warfare and more like an experiment. The coalition's response was swift and frenzied. Strategists, scientists, and diplomats convened in a storm of accusations and fear. The council chamber became a battleground of its own, voices clashing between retaliation and retreat. Some demanded that they abandon all attempts at communication, that they treat this presence not as an enigma but as a hostile force beyond redemption. Others argued that to react with violence would seal their fate, that they could not hope to understand a consciousness so alien through the language of war. Mason stood among them, a figure both respected and burdened by the weight of experience. She had seen the darkness that could fester in the absence of understanding. She had witnessed the toll of conflict, the cost of assuming that the unknown could only be an enemy. And yet, she could not deny the truth: the coalition had underestimated what they faced. This was not a misunderstanding born of cultural divides, it was a miscalculation of scale, of perspective. They were confronting a presence that did not see them as allies or adversaries but as variables, elements to be observed, studied, or discarded. The second ambush fractured the coalition's already fragile unity. Trust, once tentative, now felt impossible. Every captain wondered if their ships would be the next to vanish, if they too would become echoes in the void, footnotes in a conflict that defied comprehension. The outpost of Calderas became a symbol of their helplessness, a testament to the reality that they faced an intelligence that could strike without warning, without recognition. In the days that followed, Mason found herself questioning the very foundation of their strategy. How do you defend against an enemy that exists beyond your perception, whose motives remain a mystery? How do you communicate with a presence that may not even comprehend communication as they understood it? The coalition's greatest minds wrestled with these questions, but there were no answers, only a deepening fear that they were glimpsing the edge of something they could not grasp. The second ambush was not merely a defeat, it was a reckoning. It forced the coalition to confront the reality that their pursuit of understanding had been built on fragile assumptions. They had believed they could reach across the void, that empathy and diplomacy could bridge the unknown. But the presence they faced was not a mirror of themselves, it was a shadow, a force that defied their attempts to categorize or contain. Commander Mason knew that the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. The coalition stood at a crossroads, caught between the urge to protect themselves through force and the hope that they could still find a way to coexist with a presence that defied their comprehension. The second ambush had left them exposed, vulnerable not just to the enemy, but to their own fears, the fear that they were no longer explorers of the unknown but subjects of an experiment they could not control. In the quiet moments aboard the Vanguard, Mason stared into the vastness of space, the wreckage of Calderas, a distant, drifting scar. She wondered if the coalition's greatest mistake had been not in misunderstanding the presence they faced, but in believing that they could ever fully understand it at all. The days that followed the second ambush were marked by a suffocating silence, a silence that did not come from the absence of sound, but from the weight of questions that had no answers. The coalition, once a force of exploration and diplomacy, now found itself caught in the grip of a growing despair. Every effort to understand the enemy had ended in failure. Every attempt at communication met with a response that seemed less like hostility and more like an indifference that chilled the soul. Commander Elora Mason had begun to feel like a ghost aboard the Vanguard. The faces of her crew, worn and haunted, reflected the same questions that tormented her. How do you fight a war against an enemy that defies your understanding? How do you find peace with a presence that views you as a curiosity at best, an obstacle at worst? The coalition's High Council demanded answers, but the scholars and strategists who once boasted of deciphering the universe now spoke in riddles, their confidence eroded by the harsh reality of the conflict. Mason's days became a cycle of patrols and debriefings, each mission blending into the next. Reports of vanished ships and silent outposts littered her desk. The coalition's intelligence network worked tirelessly to decipher patterns in the attacks, to understand the logic of the unseen enemy. Yet the harder they tried, the further they seemed from grasping any true understanding. It was as if they were attempting to unravel a tapestry woven by hands that had never known the need for communication and intelligence that functioned on a level beyond their grasp. Then came the signal. At first, it was dismissed as a malfunction, a garbled transmission buried in static, picked up by an outpost near the fringe of coalition space. But as the technicians worked to filter the noise, to isolate the signal from the chaos of the cosmos, something emerged, something that was unmistakably intentional. It was not a voice, not a language that could be translated in the conventional sense, but a pattern. A sequence of frequencies that pulsed with a deliberate, calculated rhythm. The coalition's linguists and mathematicians swarmed the data, analyzing and debating until a breakthrough was made. The pattern was not random, it was a fractal, an intricate design that folded upon itself in endless complexity. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. The enemy's communication was not verbal, not written, it was an expression of thought through patterns, through the manipulation of data on a level that transcended spoken language. Their attacks had not been random acts of violence, they had been probing, testing, seeking to understand the coalition in the same way the coalition sought to understand them. The coalition's defenses, their attempts to communicate, had been interpreted not as peace offerings, but as anomalies, distortions to be studied, catalogued, and corrected. Mason sat in the conference chamber of the Vanguard, surrounded by the coalition's brightest minds. Holographic projections of the fractal patterns filled the air, shifting and rotating with a beauty that bordered on the divine. There was a sense of awe, of standing on the edge of a revelation that could redefine their understanding of intelligence itself. Yet there was fear as well, the fear of what it meant to be seen as an object of study, a species dissected by an intelligence so vast that it could only perceive them as fragments of data. As the coalition's analysts worked to develop a response, a way to mirror the patterns, to attempt communication on the enemy's terms, Mason found herself grappling with a truth that was both humbling and terrifying. They had never been at war with an enemy driven by malice or conquest. They had been caught in the gaze of an intelligence that viewed them as variables, pieces of a vast equation to be examined, altered, or discarded. The realization spread through the coalition like wildfire. It ignited debates, fractured alliances, and forced every member species to confront their own sense of significance. Some saw it as an opportunity, a chance to connect with a consciousness that had transcended the limitations of individuality. Others saw it as a threat, an enemy that could not be reasoned with, that could not be swayed by the rhetoric of diplomacy or the threat of force. Mason's nights became restless. She found herself staring at the fractal patterns, her mind wandering through the infinite loops of their complexity. How could they hope to bridge a gap so vast? How could they communicate with an intelligence that had no concept of individuality, no comprehension of the fears and hopes that defined them as beings? The coalition's decision was made to attempt a response, to reach across the divide with a signal that mirrored the fractal language of the enemy. It was a gamble, a leap of faith that could either lead to understanding or obliteration. The transmission was sent, a sequence of patterns woven with the coalition's own interpretations, an attempt to show that they, too, sought understanding. The response, when it came, was slow, agonizingly so. Days stretched into weeks, the coalition holding its breath as they waited for an answer. When it finally arrived, it was not the thunderous declaration of a superior intellect nor the cold dismissal of a distant presence. It was a pattern subtle, intricate, an echo of their own attempt. A reply that suggested curiosity, an acknowledgement that they had been seen. For Mason, it was a moment of profound uncertainty. The revelation had torn away the illusion of control, of comprehension. They were not the explorers they had once imagined themselves to be, charting the unknown with confident steps. They were wanderers in a vast, uncharted wilderness, observed by a presence that they could neither control nor fully understand. And yet, within that uncertainty, there was hope. The second ambush had been a wound, a fracture in their understanding. But the revelation that followed offered a chance, a fragile, delicate chance to move beyond fear, to see themselves not as conquerors or victims, but as a part of something far greater than they had ever known.